Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Progressive Era, which, as you can see, covers about 1900 to the 1920s and the beginning of the Jazz Age. It's called the Progressive Era for its age of reform, its age of progression, if you want to think of it that way. Getting away from those robber barons of the Gilded Age, getting more of control on capitalism and excessive spending and this massive gap between the rich and the poor. The road to progressivism was paved by the politics of populism. The Greenback Labor Party of the 1870s sought to thwart the power of the robber barons and wanted inflationary monetary measures to curb debt. The Greenbacks helped spur government regulations on business and banking. The legacy of populism is prevalent in the Progressive Era and its progressive reforms. It's another key factor for its success and the influence of the populist movement. Populism, though it did fail as a third-party cause, it had a strong political influence for the next 25 years after its failure in the 1896 election. Some of the populist ideas that carry forward include railroad legislation, the idea of the income tax, which we'll get with the 16th Amendment in 1912, the expansion of currency and the credit structure, direct election of senators, which we'll get with the 17th Amendment, initiative referendum and recall, which is dealing with local voting rights, which we'll talk about in a minute. Postal Savings Bank, the sub-treasury plan, if you remember that, something that the Southerners wanted from the Populist Party. Though the populist ideas were geared towards rural life, farming, many of its ideas appealed to urban progressives who sought to regulate trusts, reduce the power of political machines and robber barons, and remedy what they saw as social injustices. The rise of progressivism is really centered around political parties, and some of the ones you see listed here. Mugwumps, for example, were reform-minded Republicans. Remember, Republicans supported more of the civil rights ideas back from the Reconstruction lecture of the late 19th century. They left to join Democrats because they desired a return to pre-monopoly America. Typically, mugwumps were men of wealth and social standing who lamented changes in America's political and social climate due to the rise of industrialists, monopolies, plutarchies, oligarchies. It was also spurred by Protestant Victorian ideals of hard work. Success was now threatened by the nouveau riche. Early mugwumps leaders of local communities were now eclipsed by political machines catering to big business. In 1884, mugwumps were Republican reformers who bolted from the party to support Grover Cleveland in the 1884 election. Again, that was discussed in the populism lecture. The emerging middle class sympathized with mugwump views and wanted a return to the equality of opportunity and moral reform, seen by some as a third great awakening. The middle class, for the most part, is what consisted of political reformers. They were intellectuals, women, journalists, social gospelites, and professionals. They saw themselves as being underrepresented. Meanwhile, industrialists and immigrants were protected by bribery, labor unions, and political machines. Nearly 1 in 7 Americans were foreign-born by 1900, and many immigrants had strong political influence, leading to the concern for native middle class. Who were the progressives? The progressives believed that efficient government could protect public interest and restore order to society. They felt that the government is an agency of human welfare, and some of the specific reforms they wanted at this time included the breaking up of trusts or monopolies, the end of political machines like Tammany Hall in larger cities, the reduction of the threat of socialism by improving workers' lives so you don't have a violent peasant uprising, which was a fear of theirs, the improvement of the poor conditions of cities, and the improvement of working conditions specifically for women and children. They also wanted to see some more consumer protections. This is the age before the Pure Food and Drug Act, the age before any type of regulation. They wanted voter reforms, including women's suffrage, and they wanted some banking reform to, again, limit the interests of big business and trusts. They also supported the prohibition of alcohol, and They supported the ideas of conservation under Teddy Roosevelt, which we'll talk about later. Some of the major reform issues of the progressive era. The big ones are trust, political machines, living and working conditions, and the idea of banking reform. So what are political machines? You've heard me mention them as something that progressives wanted to dismantle, but we haven't really talked about what they are. So political machines are basically a protective force for immigrants, but they ended up being very, very corrupt. Bosses, as you can see, Boss Tweed is over here, one of the most famous bosses of all, ended up controlling districts or major cities and regularly accepted bribes from special interests, usually big businesses, for favors. Taxpayers often ended up footing the bill for those bribes. For these favors, oftentimes you would have the overcharging of supplies, like $50 for a toilet seat, etc. These bosses did allow and help immigrants, so they kind of got people to vote for their cause by influencing immigrants. Immigrants would come in, they would need a place to work, a place to live, and these bosses would graciously provide those things in exchange for votes. And those votes are basically how they gained all of their power in these cities. The shame of cities is something we've already talked about with our urbanization lecture, but it is one of the main focuses of the progressive reformers, and it is essential to understanding kind of why people were so motivated to get involved. Between 1880 and 1920, about 27 million immigrants entered the U.S., mostly from Eastern and Southern Europe. Though a third did go back home, that means 2/3 of them stayed, and that is a large number of people to stay and build cities. This was added to by many rural Americans who came to cities looking for work due to increased opportunities, better pay, and the declining prices for farmers. Cities also offered entertainment, shopping, new technology like electricity and indoor plumbing, and individualism. The result of all of these new opportunities and these changes meant that living conditions in many parts of large cities were absolutely revolting. If you remember our discussion about Dunbell tenements and the inadequate health conditions and safety conditions from the urbanization lecture, you can picture what this was like in your mind. There was also a lot of concerns about working conditions. An estimated 500,000 workers were wounded and 30,000 killed in industrial accidents every single year in the early 20th century. Despite this, the American Federation of Labor discouraged labor legislation except child labor, since previous pro-labor laws have been used against labor, like the Sherman Antitrust Act, which meant that there wasn't a lot of effective legislation at this time for protections. Something that this time period does have going for it is a success for education. Between 1870 and 1920, college enrollment increased by 400%. Many colleges were created as part of the big boom philanthropy by Carnegie and others, and women were increasingly encouraged to go to school. Many of the colleges also created kind of separate social sciences departments, which was a brand new idea. Topics such as economics, political science, sociology were all new concepts to be studied at universities. Among some of the top education reformers of this time was a man named John Dewey. Best remembered for his idea of learn by doing, or the early idea of trade schools. He basically advocated that you can learn by doing more than just reading. You can learn by working and learn by actually performing a task. He believed that education was something that should be done for life, that the primary goal of teaching should be in order to prepare you to be a useful adult, prepare you to work. And he believed that you should prepare the student to survive in the current or the modern world. Another such progressive reformer is Lester Frank Ward, who challenged the idea of survival of the fittest, or that Darwinist thought process from before. He argued it was natural for people to control and change their social environments, laws, customs, and relationships among people. And probably most significantly, he argued that it was the role of government to shape society's destiny. So he believed in legislation that would address adequate housing, poverty, safety of workers. Some other notable social scientists include Richard Ely, professor at Madison, Wisconsin, known for economics. Woodrow Wilson, who was a political scientist and then later became president, as we all know. In addition to these kind of education-based thinkers, we also have early progressive writers and social critics that were very influential and studied in universities. Henry Demas Lloyd, who wrote Wealth Against Commonwealth in 1894, criticized the Standard Oil Company and the kind of aggressive, shall we say, tactics of Rockefeller. Jacob A. Riis, who we've talked a lot about, that photojournalist who ended up writing How the Other Half Lives. He exposed the dirt, disease, and misery of the rat-infested New York slums. One of his pictures was on the previous slide. Then we also have Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Women in Economics, which we talked a little bit about her before. Her work is now considered kind of a masterpiece of feminist literature because she does something that at that time was considered radical but now isn't. She encouraged women to go get jobs, work outside the home, and become independent so that they could be more involved and have more control over their personal lives. She also advocated for the idea of daycare or centralized nurseries and cooperative kitchens so that women could more easily enter into the workforce. The social gospel movement overall focused on the role of church in the improving of lives on earth. If you remember Walter Rauschenbusch, who we talked about in the previous lecture, that preacher who advocated that it was kind of the sins of the city that was really the problem, not the person itself. So social gospel movement reformers influenced others like those involved in the Settlement House movement or the Salvation Army. And then another set of writers that is probably very well known, don't get them confused with yellow journalism, which we'll talk about when we talk about imperialism, but muckraking journalists like Jacob A. Riis were kind of the progressive reform knights of journalism at this time period. They were journalists who attempted to expose the evils of society, usually through some type of shock and awe tactic, to grab hold of their audience, usually middle-class white audience, and just kind of force them to see the truth and be so shocked by what they're being told that they take action. The term muckrakers is actually a term name given by Theodore Roosevelt, who was a critic of this type of journalism. But their type of journalism was, as you can see, very effective. One of the most well-known works of muckraking journalism is, of course, by Upton Sinclair in his book The Jungle, published in 1906, where he gives graphic depictions of unsanitary conditions in meatpacking plants that eventually leads to Theodore Roosevelt himself passing the Meat Inspection and Pure Food and Drug Act in the same year. We discussed again some of these writers, and we've discussed Jane Addams a little bit in previous lectures, but progressive crusaders sought to improve the living conditions in cities and labor reform for women and children. Cities had been opportunities for women. Over 1 million joined the workforce in the 1890s, but not always in the best conditions. Social workers, they became social workers, secretaries, store clerks, seamstresses, telephone operators, bookkeepers, but the largest section of work for women was really being nannies, usually for those in the middle class and upper class. And usually these female workers were, again, immigrant and usually poor. Jane Addams, again, is probably the most well-known of these early female reformers who sought really an improvement in city conditions for immigrants. She's a first-generation college-educated woman who kind of wanted to break out of the idea of just teaching and volunteering being the only things permissible for upper-class women of class. She is the one who sets out and creates the Hull House in Chicago, which is important in establishing the settlement house movement that became centers for women's activism and social reform. Beyond this, some historians see progressivism as beginning in 1889, with the founding of the Hull House itself. Eventually, the settlement house movement will help found the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And it will also win her, Jane Addams, the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. All right, so women and child labor reform, again, was one of the crowning achievements of the progressive era. It's by far the most successful aspect of the progressive reform movements. Florence Kelley, who is actually associated with the settlement house movement early on, investigated and reported on child labor while living at the Hull House. Kelley championed the welfare of women, blacks, and consumers who at this time, again, had no rights. She was a leader of the National Consumers League, and she helped organize consumer boycotts of goods made by children or workers toiling in unsanitary or dangerous conditions. Kelley did have a couple socialist views which kind of put her at odds with some of the politicians at this time period, but she was successful in gaining some reforms because women were the primary consumers and boycotts were often pretty effective, being led and organized by women. The Muller versus Oregon court case you see on here and these other court cases all have to deal with the gaining of rights for women. The Muller versus Oregon court case was in 1906 when the Supreme Court upheld the Oregon law restricting women's labor to 10-hour workdays. The case was won by Louis Brandeis, who argued that women were weaker than men. Today this argument would be seen as very chauvinistic, very inappropriate, but back then it appealed to the Supreme Court, males, white, upper class, and it made sense to them. Following this decision, a number of other laws were passed at the federal and the state level protecting and restricting the number of hours for women and children to work. But by far, the most influential occurrence was actually brought about by the tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in 1911, and I have a short clip of part of a documentary for you to watch on your own about this fire. The fire ended up killing 146 women, mostly girls, who had kind of been locked into this factory in order to ensure that they stayed and worked. But because the doors were locked, they were trapped in. When a fire broke loose, most perished. But these women were actually from fairly well-to-do families, and it completely devastated New York City. New York City and other legislatures immediately passed laws regulating the hours and conditions in sweatshops like this factory. And by 1916, 32 states had regulated the hours and ages at which children could work. Some states even adopted compulsory education up to the level of high school in order to kind of protect children from working in factories at too young of an age. All right, so some of the political reforms, you see this kind of cartoonized pictures of Robert Lefol and the Wisconsin experiment. And I put Dig-Sig up here as a kind of a memory aid. So D for the Wisconsin experiment would stand for the direct election of senators, again the 17th Amendment. I would stand for initiative, referendum, and recall, and G would stand for government regulation of business. The C in SID would stand for civil reform, service reform. The I would stand for income tax at the state level, and the D would stand for direct primary. All of those things listed basically encompass the goals of Mr. Robert over here. So it gets kind of the name the Wisconsin experiment because Robert Lefol was the governor of Wisconsin in 1901. He helped destroy the political machine and take control over lumber and railroad trusts and helped establish the progressive reform and progressive government in Wisconsin. He was the first of Republican insurgents to reach the Senate, and he stood against Republican Old Guard, the GRA, who favored laissez-faire or hands-off government policies. So he was advocating for federal regulation of trusts and federal regulation over big business. Robert worked closely with experts on the faculty of the State University of Madison, and he regulated public utilities by instituting Public Utilities Commission that created legislation for worker safety at railroads and regulation of public utilities. During the direct primary in 1903, Lefol pressured the legislatures to institute an election open to all voters within a party and introduced the idea of initiative, referendum, and recall, or the idea of initiative allowing citizens themselves to introduce a bill, referendum, voters allowed to cast ballots for or against a proposed law, and then recall, I usually refer to this as kind of impeachment at the local level. It's giving the citizens the right to remove elected officials from office. In 1913, we officially have the approval of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which adopts in the state income tax. This was a direct result of Wisconsin and Robert in Wisconsin, as Wisconsin was the first state to do so. The Australia ballot that you see on here, I wrote counteract boss rule. Remember the political machines and boss Tweed as the example. Really, the Australian ballot becomes kind of the rule of the law in order to eliminate political machines, but it will disenfranchise poor whites. What the Australian ballot is kind of what you think of today. It's where voting is done in secret. You are not being monitored, and you cannot have bribers, or in this case, members of the political machine, follow you into the voting booth and help in quotes, help you vote. It does limit the power of political machines in that they can no longer influence voters directly and make sure voters are voting for who they want. But it also disenfranchises hundreds of thousands of black and poor white voters who don't know how to read and no longer have assistance in voting. So it has a good and bad, but it very quickly becomes the policy of the land in that you have secret ballots for all votes. The other thing I put on here is the commission system, because this is also something that's kind of established as part of the Wisconsin experiment and becomes kind of the law of the land, so to speak. Galveston, Texas, in September of 1900 has a tidal wave completely devastate the city, and their response is to establish a commission system to deal with the disaster. They put in place 5 commissioners, 2 elected and 3 appointed, to basically take care of city management. This worked out so well that within 20 years, 400 cities had adopted the commission system, so like you have a fire commissioner, etc. It does also reduce the power of political machines, but in some cases these reforms valued efficiency more than democracy, as civic control was further removed from the hands of the people. And businessmen tended to dominate these commission positions because they had the wealth and the influence to get them. All right, so all of this brings us to, of course, Teddy Roosevelt, President Theodore Roosevelt. He's very iconic, remembered for his mustache and glasses. He is the first president in U.S. history to use the government to directly help public interests. And he's often seen as kind of the first modern president. He saw the presidency as a bully pulpit to preach his ideas, and he supported progressive reform with strong rhetoric, but in reality was more of a moderate and conservative president, middle-of-the-road kind of politician on his policies. Roosevelt often bypassed congressional opposition, like Jackson, to reach reform. He was enormously popular among a large percentage of Americans, and he was the first president to play a significant role in world affairs with his idea of big stick diplomacy, or speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far, which we'll talk a lot more about that idea when we get to the imperialism lecture and gunboat diplomacy and the building of the Panama Canal. Some of the ideas central to President Roosevelt's presidency: he embraced something called the 3 Cs, or the regulation of corporations, the embracing of consumer protections, and the conservation of natural resources. He also embraced the regulation of corporations. He worked very hard to limit big business. He eventually will help create the Department of Commerce and Labor in 1903, and the Bureau of Corporations. He's often remembered as kind of a trust-busting president, though other presidents after him have actually broken up more trust than he himself did. And he's also remembered for consumer protections. Remember, he passes the FDA, the Federal Food and Drug Act, in response to the jungle. And he is one of the few presidents who puts aside massive amounts of land to create public parks and national forests. So Roosevelt will oversee the regulation of corporations, again, one of those 3 Cs. And really what kind of spurs this to start off with his presidency is the anthracite coal strike in 1902. It is the anthracite coal is the hard coal that's used to heat homes, so it's very important to have coal going into winter. In this strike, 140,000 workers of the United Mine Workers Union in Coal Mines of Pennsylvania went on strike, demanding a 20% pay increase, a reduction to the workday from 10 to 9 hours, and the fair weighing of coal and better safety conditions. George F. Beer, president of the company, assumed the public would react against the miners, as they had done in all of the previous disputes between business and labor, and he refused to arbitrate or negotiate with the union. Bear demanded that Roosevelt persecute the union leader for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, as President Cleveland had done in the Pullman strike of 1894, but being the kind of trust-busting president that he was, Roosevelt threatened instead to seize the mines and operate them with federal troops if owners refused to compromise, which is an unprecedented action in U.S. history. Roosevelt rationalized that the public at large was in jeopardy of having no coal during the winter, and it was his duty to intervene. The owners eventually do consent with the lack of support from Roosevelt. They negotiate, and the miners get a 10% pay increase versus the 20% they wanted. They get a 9-hour workday, and they get assurances that the union would be officially recognized by the government. They also, in exchange for this agreement, as kind of a bridge between them, the owners, and the government allows for a 10% price increase of coal to cover the pay increase for the workers. The result of this, the coal strike, contributes to the founding of the Department of Commerce and Labor. Roosevelt realizes that there is a need for some type of entity to help deal with these disagreements between labor and corporations, and the previous policies and approaches of just sending in troops was not working. So the Department of Commerce and Labor is created in 1903 to settle disputes between capital and labor. 10 years later, the institution is going to be split into two. The Bureau of Corporations is part of the Department of Commerce and Labor, which is authorized to monitor businesses and interstate commerce and help break up monopolies. In 1902, President Roosevelt will use this arm of the corporation to attack the Northern Securities Company as part of his trust-busting presidency. It's a holding company owned by J.P. Morgan and James G. Hill, who had a monopoly on railroads in the Northwest. The Supreme Court upholds Roosevelt's antitrust suit and dissolves the company in 1904. Roosevelt, from this point on, is seen as a massive trust-busting president. In 1905, the Supreme Court declared the beef trust illegal, a sugar trust, fertilizing, harvests, and regulated other antitrust legislation. So he does open the way for breaking up of trusts. But again, other presidents will actually break up more trusts than Roosevelt does himself. As another part of Roosevelt's trust-busting efforts, the Elkins Act will be passed in 1903, aimed primarily at reducing abuses of rebates used by railroads for big business. allowing for heavy fines to be imposed on railroads and shippers who abused rebates. On top of this, in 1906 will be the Hepburn Act, which is far more effective. It's kind of the enforcement branch of the Elkins Act. It expanded the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Hepburn Act did. And it severely restricted railroads giving of free passes or bribery to influential figures. The act could nullify existing rates and stipulate maximum rates for railroad charges if it needed to. Overall, Roosevelt really felt that there were good trusts and there were bad trusts that were overly greedy. Bad trusts should be prosecuted, they should be eliminated, whereas good trusts were healthy for the economy. Again, he believed in regulating rather than fragmenting trusts. Alright, so the consumer protection part of Roosevelt's 3 C's, again, really comes from Upton Sinclair and the publishing of The Jungle in 1906. And you have a little video here about the Pure Food and Drug Act that I would encourage you to watch on your own. The public was really outraged after reading The Jungle. It is absolutely sickening when you read the descriptions of what people were eating at this time period. And it just led to an investigation at the highest levels. Roosevelt didn't know if he should trust this publication. There's been a lot of, there's no regulation of journalism, so he has it investigated, finds out that the claims being made by Sinclair are indeed true, and he passes the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. Really, the Meat Inspection Act says that the preparation of meat shipped over state lines would be subject to federal inspection throughout the meat-making process. Though the largest packers resisted certain features of the act, they accepted it because it meant that smaller businesses would not be able to compete. The Pure Food and Drug Act, which is probably more important overall, is also passed in the same year, 1906. It prevented the falsification or the mislabeling of food and drugs. So no longer do you have like the Sweeney Todd magical elixir of, pea in a jar. Now you have to label medications, you have to label any food that is going to be consumed. Alright, conservation is the last of the 3 C's for Roosevelt. It's probably the most significant and long-lasting of Roosevelt's legacies. Roosevelt's and his conservation efforts go all the way back to prior to his presidency. He was always an outdoorsman. He was appalled at the destruction of timber and mineral resources, and he kind of pairs up with his friend, Gifford Pincott, and puts him in charge, Pincott, of the Federal Division of Forestry. And together, they make it so that there's protected lands. They're most well remembered for national parks and expanding the amount of land that's considered protected national parks. But they also sought policies that allowed for the wise use of logging and mineral rights. They wanted to, allow for business, allow for the expansion and the use of these resources without completely destroying the land while you did it. They also passed, Roosevelt, the New Land Reclamation Acts of 1902. The government was authorized to collect money from the sale of public lands in western states and use those funds for the development of irrigation projects. So settlers repaid the cost of the reclamation by building successful farms in the areas where the irrigation was being used. Dozens of dams were constructed as a result of this on virtually every major western river in the subsequent decades. Again, Teddy Roosevelt is remembered for setting aside 125 acres of forest in federal reserves, about 3 times that of his predecessors. He also earmarked millions of acres of coal deposits as well as water resources useful for irrigation and power. So Roosevelt will win the 1904 election due to his efforts against trusts and for the 3 C's. He's elected in his own right by a large electoral margin over the Democrat candidate Parker. Eugene B. Debs, who, if you remember him from the Pullman strike activity, he was a leading labor union representative, but he will now run as the socialist candidate in this election. The Prohibition Party will also run a candidate, Silas C. Swallow, though they have very limited success. Unfortunately for Roosevelt, his second term is really going to be plagued by an economic depression, which hits in 1907. Wall Street suffered a short but brutal panic in 1907. There were many runs on banks, increases in suicides, crime, just general misfortune, a lot of bankruptcies and bank failures. Roosevelt cooperated with Morgan banks and other large banks to prevent banking collapse by transferring millions of treasury funds from one bank to another. The cause of the panic centered around speculation or over-speculation and the mismanagement in Wall Street banks and trust companies, as well as overextension of credit to foreign investments. Business leaders assailed Roosevelt for causing the panic. They argued that his anti-business tactics were the reason for the financial setbacks, and they actually labeled this panic the, quote, Roosevelt panic. Roosevelt, of course, feels wounded by these criticisms and turns around and accuses Wall Street of engineering the panic. As a result of these accusations, Roosevelt embarks on a second wave of trust busting. He reforms a lot of large trusts, starts breaking them apart. It became more acceptable, so his reforms were more easily integrated. The panic showed that there was an acute need for greater elasticity or greater fluidity to the money supply. During the panic, banks were unable to increase the volume of currency in circulation. Those banks with money were reluctant to loan money to fellow banks in need. This apparent weakness paved the way for the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which lasted through this time period into the 1930s. During the panic, labor and local reformers gained important middle-class allies. Roosevelt began incorporating Bryan's from the Populist Party ideas into legislation, and the progressives finally embraced reforms put forth by reformers in the early 1900s. All right, so we've gotten through Roosevelt's first and second term in office. His first term went much better with the 3 C's, and then his second term with that bank panic didn't go quite as well. Now we have William H. Taft, William Howard Taft, who will be elected in 1908. He will defeat Bryan, and it's the third time Bryan unfortunately is defeated in 12 years, but he actually will follow some of the populist ideas of Bryan and even Debs, who chooses to run yet again. Taft overall lacks some of the political fire and guts that Roosevelt had. Taft is content to keep the status quo rather than kind of rocking the boat. He adopted an attitude of passivity towards Congress, and he wasn't very aggressive towards insurgent Republicans and Democrats who opposed his policies. Taft became an ally of the old guard Republicans by default, and his cabinet did not contain one member of Roosevelt's reformist wing. Taft's policies centered on something called dollar diplomacy, which argued that the goal of diplomacy was to create stability and order abroad, so it would best promote American commercial interests. The U.S., he thought, should use private capital to further U.S. interests overseas, which would lead to extensive intervention in the Caribbean and Central America. Overall, there are 2 aspects to this idea of dollar diplomacy. U.S. policy is needed to protect Wall Street dollars and invest abroad. The money in turn would be used to uphold U.S. foreign policy in those nations which were invested in. Taft, like Roosevelt, is also seen as a trust-busting president. He brought 90 suits against trust during his 4 years in office, 2 times that of Roosevelt's. The most famous of which is probably the 1911 case between the United States versus the American Tobacco Company. in which the company was ordered to reorganize based on the rule of reason, but did not have to dissolve. He kind of sets out the idea of the rule of reason, or the idea that only reasonable restraints to trade were authorized. So if any company is restricting trade beyond a reasonable restraint, then it is authorized to be subject to being dismantled. Some of the other protective and progressive legislations that were passed under Taft, in terms of conservation, Taft's contributions equaled or outdid Roosevelt's. The Bureau of Mines was established to control mineral resources, rescued millions of acres of western coal lands from exploitation, and also allowed for protected waters sites to not be developed. The Postal Savings Bank system in 1910, Postal Savings Bank system in 1910 authorized the receiving of savings deposits for individuals to pay interest of 2% per year. This is the success of a major populist idea. So the Populist Party had suggested the creation of basically federal savings banks, which is what this is. Unfortunately for the Republican Party, there is going to be a massive split in the Republican Party over tariffs. The Payne-Aldrich tariff in 1909 is probably the most important cause for this split. Progressives wanted a lower tariff, which Taft, kind of following the footsteps of Roosevelt, had promised as part of his campaign platforms. But the old guard, who he kind of ends up dealing with, wanted a higher tariff, and they resisted the lowering of the tariff for progressives. The Payne-Aldrich tariff itself reduces the tariff, but it is a betrayal to campaign promises, because Taft had claimed that the best bill that the Republican Party ever passed was this Payne-Aldrich tariff, but the tariff had so many additives tacked onto it that even though it was intended to reduce the tariff, by the time you get to and through all of the additives tacked onto the bill, it actually ends up raising the tariff by a fairly significant percentage. So the fact that Taft backs this tariff so adamantly meant that he had completely betrayed the Progressive Party, and by extension the Republican Party and the previous supporters of Roosevelt who had supported him when he ran. Taft's party is going to be further hurt by the Ballinger-Pincott controversy. So if you remember, Pincott is the person appointed by Roosevelt to head the Federal Division of Forestry. And Ballinger and Pincott are going to come into a disagreement that will eventually lead to a further split in the Republican Party. The Secretary of the Interior, Ballinger, opens lands in Wyoming, Montana, and Alaska to corporate development, but did not share Pincott's desire to reduce mining. Ballinger was sharply criticized by Pincott, the chief of the Agricultural Department's Division of Forestry, and a strong Roosevelt supporter. Taft unfortunately dismisses this response by Pincott on the narrow grounds of insubordination, and basically forces Pincott out of office to just make this problem go away. The result is a storm of protests that arose from conservationists and Roosevelt's friends in government. A congressional committee exonerated Pincott, which contributed to a further split in the Republican Party between Taft and Roosevelt. Eventually, you will have the rise of Roosevelt's new nationalism, or basically Roosevelt completely splitting away from the Republican Party. So Roosevelt had been out of the country during 1909 and the first half of 1910, when the tariff and conservation issues were all being brought to fruition. He gives a very important speech in Kansas in 1910 that shocked the old guard Republicans with a new doctrine which he termed New Nationalism. New nationalism urged federal government to increase its power to remedy economic and social abuses. It called for the regulation of large corporations, tariff reform, graduated income and inheritance taxes, currency reform, the sale of public lands to true settlers, labor reform, and the strict accounting of campaign funds. Roosevelt, in this speech, argued that the object of government is the welfare of the people. The material progress and prosperity of a nation are desirable chiefly so far that they lead to the moral and material welfare of all good citizens. Roosevelt's views marked a new era in politics where the old guard Republicans were now on the defensive, even within their own party. Republicans lost significantly in congressional elections and mid-season elections in 1910 as a result of this split, the first time in the 20th century that the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. In 1911, Taft passed an antitrust suit against the USX Steel Corporation, and in response, Roosevelt was infuriated as he himself had actually been involved in helping J.P. Morgan acquire the Tennessee Coal and Oil Company to create the U.S. Steel Corporation in 1907. Eventually, these disagreements between Taft and Roosevelt lead to a permanent split. Early in 1911, the National Progressive Republican League formed to address the Republican split. Robert LaFool of Wisconsin became its leading candidate for the Republican presidential nominee, but eventually he gets elbowed aside, almost literally, by Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt reasoned that the third term tradition applied to 3 consecutive terms, and he ran despite stating previously that he would not run again, stating, "My hat is in the ring." Roosevelt became the progressive candidate at the 1912 Republican Convention in Chicago, where Republicans gave Taft the nominee. Progressives ended up leaving the Republican Party to form a third party called the Bull Moose Party under Roosevelt. The old Republican Guard controlled the Republican Party as a result, and the progressives were now gone, creating their own platform. The election of 1912, you have the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, the Republican Taft, and the Progressive Republican, or the Bull Moose Party, Roosevelt's. Some of the minor ones, Eugene V. Debs, again, that Union leader, runs yet again for the Socialist Party. Woodrow Wilson will run under the platform of antitrust legislation, monetary changes, and tariff reductions under the idea of the New Freedom Platform, favoring small enterprise and entrepreneurship and free competitive economy without monopolies. The Progressive Republican Party under Roosevelt will basically be the idea of new nationalism that we talked about before. So the progressive ideals, he wants to set a liberal agenda for the next 50 years. The results is that Wilson wins. President Wilson will become the president to oversee, of course, World War I, which is probably what he is most remembered for. He himself was born in Virginia and was the first president since Taylor in 1848 to come from one of the succeeded southern states. He's a serious student of government. He's a professor, later president of Princeton University, but he's also, unfortunately, a white supremacist. He didn't support efforts to improve the rights of blacks. He believed the president should play a dynamic role in government. Congress could not function properly unless the president provided proper leadership, so he ends up taking some power away from Congress as a result of his views. Wilson felt that it was the government's responsibility to pass good laws and let the courts enforce them. He did not believe that the president should be involved in enforcement of laws. He was very successful as a governor and president in bypassing legislatures and appealing directly to the people, so he's kind of a man of the people. And he was not willing to go as far as Roosevelt in government activism, but he was still an activist. So he wasn't, again, the leader of the Progressive Party, but he was definitely there and supportive of reforms. Unfortunately, he also, unlike Roosevelt, lacked kind of a common touch, so he wasn't as appealing to the common man. His moral righteousness made him often uncompromising, and we'll talk about his uncompromising positions when we talk about the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. One of the major accomplishments of Wilson was the Underwood Tariff Bill, which was passed in 1913. Sometimes you'll hear it called the Underwood-Simmons Tariff. In an unprecedented move, this act called Congress into special session in early 1913 and read a message in person rather than having his clerk read it, where he presented the Underwood Tariff Bill to Congress. The tariff bill passed by the House as a result, and Wilson appealed to the people to demand their senators to pass the bill as well. The bill substantially reduced the tariff to 29% from about 37-40% under the Payne-Aldrich tariff under Taft. It also enacted a graduated income tax under the authority granted by the recently ratified 16th Amendment. The new income tax was set at a rate of 1% on incomes over $4,000, 7% on incomes over $500,000. By 1917, revenue from income tax exceeded tariff revenues, and the gap has widened since then. Building on the successes of the Underwood Tariff Bill, Wilson also pushes through the Federal Reserve Act in the same year. It created the Federal Reserve System, the nation's existing national banking act, enacted during the Civil War, showed its weaknesses during the 1907 panic. Basically, what this act does is it allows for the equal distribution of money. They realized in the 1907 panic that it was hard to move money from powerful banks to struggling banks in times of distress. So this allowed for more reserves across the country. In addition to addressing the banking crisis of 1907 and then later on, he also addressed trust busting, just like the presidents before him. Again, he was reform-minded. Wilson helps to enact the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. Early 1914, Wilson again went to Congress to appeal for regulation of trust. 9 months later, Congress passed the bill to crush monopolies at the source. This act empowered the president to appoint a commissioner to monitor industries in interstate commerce. To cease and desist, the act built on consumer protections that allowed for cease and desist orders. Commissioners could end unfair trade practices, unlawful competition, false advertising, mislabeling, and bribery. But just like all of the other acts we've seen trying to regulate trade and commerce, it lacks an enforcement power. The government didn't vigorously regulate trusts, so it's not as effective as it would seem. Wilson also enacted the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. The purpose of the act was to implement the Sherman Antitrust Act by increasing the list of business practices deemed objectable, including price discrimination and interlocking directorates. Interlocking directorate provisions were not enforced, however, and were eventually dropped. The act exempted labor and agricultural organizations from antitrust prosecution while explicitly legalizing strikes and peaceful picketing. This is really important because the Sherman Antitrust Act was one of the key acts used in the Pullman strike against workers, used to eventually jail Eugene V. Debs for 6 months. So the Sherman Antitrust Act was repeatedly being used to actually jail union leaders. So this Clayton Antitrust Act makes it impossible to do that. Union leaders like Samuel Gompers hailed the act as the Magna Carta of labor. However, provisions were weak because it did not explicitly state what was and what wasn't legal union activity. Wilson refused to go further with the act to strengthen the sections related to union activity, which led to this weak intentionality with it. The act sought to prevent repeat of the Danbury Hatters case in 1908 that had assessed over $250,000 on striking hat makers, alleging they'd violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The act worked to increase union membership, and by 1917, the American Federation of Labor membership had reached more than 3 million. In 1910, it had only been 1.5 million, down from the 2 million it had been in 1904. So overall, Wilson's plans can be summed up, or his major achievements of his presidency can kind of be summed up with CUF. C stands for the Clayton Antitrust Act. U stands for the Underwood Tariff Bill. F stands for the Federal Reserve Act. And then the final F stands for the Federal Trade Commission. Some of the other progressive reforms under Wilson, in order for him to win the election of 1916, Wilson signed other reforms into legislation. In order to get re-elected, Wilson embraced some of Roosevelt's new nationalism ideas and acted for progressives. So he appointed Louis Brandeis, the people's lawyer, to the Supreme Court. He enacted the Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916, which allowed for low interest credits for farmers. He enacted the Warehouse Act of 1916, which authorized loans on the security of stable crops, kind of like the populist sub-treasury plan. He enacts the Federal Highway Commission, which provided highway construction in rural areas, the Smith-Levy Act, which established agricultural extension work in state colleges. He also enacts the Workingmen's Compensation Act of 1916, which gave assistance to federal civil service employees during periods of disability. And the Child Labor Act of 1916, so all these acts are in 1916, which restricted child labor on products in interstate commerce. This is the first time the Congress has regulated labor with a state using interstate commerce power, and but it was invalidated by the Supreme Court in 1918 on the grounds that it interfered with states' powers. So it doesn't last very long. All right, so all of these acts leads us into the Supreme Court and what it was doing at this time period. The Supreme Court overall is very conservative in this time period, and it overturned a lot of the progressive gains made in Congress and the states. Locklear versus New York in 1905 represented a setback for the 10-hour workday movement as the court invalidated a New York 10-hour law for bakers. But in 1917, the court revised its decision, upheld the 10-hour law for factory workers. So they're kind of going back and forth with laws at this time period. In 1819, again, the Supreme Court overturns the Child Labor Act of 1960, saying it validated states' rights. And they overturned the Atkin versus Children's Hospital Act, which set a minimum wage for women in Washington, D.C. The Schneck versus U.S. case is perhaps the most significant case. In 1919, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. stated that Congress could limit free speech when words represented a, quote, clear and present danger that will bring about evils that Congress has the right to prevent. The most famous example is that you can't cry fire in a crowded theater. They believe the importance of protecting the principle of freedom of thought, not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought we hate. Wilson again appointed Louis D. Brandeis, who is the first Jewish person to be appointed to the Supreme Court. Brandeis had a national representation as the people's lawyer for his then unique trait of defending public cases without a fee. In the Mueller versus Oregon case, where we'd mentioned a little bit earlier in the lecture in 1908, again, Brandeis pioneers the new type of appellate legal brief, emphasizing economic and social evidence rather than legal procedures, known as kind of the Brandeis brief, which became the prototype for later reforms in litigation. This period is also known for Prohibition. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, which we mentioned in the last lecture, led by Frances Willard, is one of the most powerful interest groups after the Civil War, and it urged women's suffrage and, of course, the prohibition of alcohol. Later, the Anti-Saloon League would be allied with the WCTU, and they would become well-organized and very well-financed. As a result of these groups' influence, several states and numerous counties would pass dry laws which controlled and restricted or even abolished alcohol during the 19th and early 20th century. By 1914, half of the US population lived in, quote, dry territories. 3/4 of the total area had outlawed the saloon. Big cities were the only areas that remained wet, mostly because of large immigrant populations like Scottish and Irish, who pushed back against prohibition laws. Really, prohibition was aided by the attitude of sacrifice that was created during World War I, which made alcohol drinking unpatriotic. The government passed laws limiting the production of alcoholic beverages during the war to allow for more wartime industries to grow. Ingredients that produce alcohol could be used for industries like feeding armies or those dislocated, rather than producing alcohol, which had no purpose. These views eventually led to the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919, which banned the sale, transport, manufacturing, or consumption of alcohol, and the Volstead Act, which was passed in 1919 to enforce the 18th Amendment. Eventually, these acts will be one of the greatest failures of the Progressive Era. They will be repealed after only 14 years, and they actually led to an increase in crime, but we'll talk a lot more about those when we get to the Jazz Age and the 1920s. Alright, so women's suffrage is another part of the Progressive Era, and the movement, oftentimes people say it got its start at Seneca Falls in New York with a convention in 1848 that was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Moss. Later, the movement is joined by Susan B. Anthony. Most mark this as the start, but you will see other dates. By the late 19th century, the women's movement had split into two. If you remember the urbanization lecture, we talked about these two factions. So the NWSA, or the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Stanton and Anthony, forbid men in the organization, whereas the AWSA, or the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone, welcomed men. Eventually, the two organizations will merge together as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA. I'm sorry for all these acronyms. In 1893. By 1890, the women had partial suffrage in 19 states, and by 1910, women had full suffrage in some states, especially more liberal Western states where women had a tradition of being more involved in government. The National American Women's Suffrage Association grew from about 13,000 in 1893 to about 75,000 in 1910 and was led by Carrie Chapman Catt. Catt was the most effective leader of the new generation of women's suffrage proponents. She de-emphasized the argument that women deserved the vote as a matter of right because they were in all respects equal to men, and instead stressed the desirability of suffrage so women could continue to discharge their traditional duties as housemakers and mothers in the increasingly public world of the city. So basically, they should be allowed to vote on public health, public police commissions, school boards. As a result, suffrages gained. She did not try to challenge the cult of domesticity, but instead used it to her gains. The, quote, winning plan emphasized lobbying Congress, effective meetings, and parades. She publicized women's contributions to the war effort for World War I, which President Wilson used in urging Congress to approve suffrage later on. With prohibition imminent as a result of World War I, the liquor lobby eased its opposition to female suffrage in an attempt to gain support with women's suffrages, but this attempt was unsuccessful. They still had suffrage. They still had prohibition, but it did help the suffrage movement. Working with Catt, Alice Paul's Congressional Union used militant tactics to gain attention. There are clips on here about the women's suffrage movement that I would encourage you to watch. Women's right to vote. Alice Paul is known for picketing the White House in 1916 and hunger strikes. She said led the most militant women out of the NAWSA to form the Congressional Union, and it was Paul and Catt who put forth the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, after 1920, though it never was ratified. Eventually, the 19th Amendment, of course, passes in 1920, granting women full suffrage and the right to vote. So African Americans also are parts of the Progressive Era, and they do gain some things, but not nearly as much as everyone else in this era. It's probably the least successful of the progressive efforts, despite having Roosevelt's early support. Roosevelt was criticized by Southerners for allowing those like Booker T. Washington to dine in the White House. Roosevelt never again publicly supported blacks after this public criticism. And as a result, the conditions for African Americans don't really improve at all until you get to the 1950s. The Great African American migration northward resulted in violence. Cities, especially where you're competing for housing and jobs. By 1920, 2 million blacks lived in the North out of 11 million, and they hoped to escape the poverty and discrimination of the South, but were met with race riots due largely to immigration populations and a competition for jobs, and race riots. The Chicago race riots is probably the most famous. It lasted 5 days as black workers and returning World War I veterans clashed. 23 blacks and 15 whites end up being killed. 520 end up being seriously injured, and over 1,000 are left homeless, and federal troops are forced to be called in to end the riots. There are several large race riots, but this is one of the more famous. Large numbers of lynchings continue between 1890 and 1920. Some of the pushback by reformers include Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was an influential leader in the anti-lynching movement and contributed to a 25% decrease in lynchings within 3 years during the 1890s. She also helped found the NAACP. African Americans did organize for increasing rights, so W.E.B. Du Bois, who actually kind of opposed Booker T. Washington's accommodating policies and demanded immediate social and economic equality for blacks, was raised in Massachusetts in contrast to Washington, who was an ex-slave from the South. Washington called for a focus on bringing African Americans to being middle class citizens. And the third and final thing we're going to discuss is the Niagara movement, the idea of the talented 10th. So Du Bois does oppose Washington, but he does help to found the Niagara movement, which demanded the immediate end to segregation and discrimination in labor unions, courts, and public accommodations. He demanded that the, quote, talented 10th of the black community be given full and immediate access to mainstream American life. And I would encourage you to watch this YouTube clip discussing the role of African Americans during the Progressive Era. The NAACP forms out of this time period as well, and again that stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It forms after the Springfield race riots in 1909, and it's actually created by a group of white progressives, including Jane Addams, John Dewey, William Dean Howells, and others. Du Bois is the director of publicity and research and the editor of their journal Crisis. Eventually, the NAACP adopted many of the goals of the Niagara movement, and by 1914, the organization had 50 branches with 6,000 members. But by the 1930s, it was a predominantly black organization. Black literacy does get cut in half, and black ownership of land increases. But again, for the most part, major advances are not made until you get to the 1950s. So the era of progressivism does have a lot of good things going for it. You have improved rights, consumer protections, conservation. You have women's suffrage, if you see prohibition as a good thing, however you want to look at that. But there are some bad things that come along with this. There is an idea of kind of conformity, using the government to enforce morality, specifically the morality of the middle class, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants on society. Native Americans especially are victimized by the progressive movement because of efforts to assimilate them or force them to be more American, force them to conform to the middle class white society. Those efforts increase dramatically, and you have a decimation of native languages and cultures. Oftentimes, progressives are actually supportive of segregation because it leads to a lack of social tension, so they're not really civil rights advocates the way we would think of in like the 50s and 60s. You have increasing support for harsh anti-immigration laws. Again, immigrants tended to be the ones who were against those more progressive policies, especially prohibition. You have the failures of the prohibition experiment. It ends after only 14 years and it leads to actually increasing crime conditions. And you also have the rise of the Red Scare, fears of socialism and communism, and eugenics, or kind of trying to create the perfect ideal race. This is epitomized in Hitler's society with selective breeding, but it can be very detrimental. All right, so just a quick memory aid for the progressive reform era. So progressives overall are anti-socialism, anti-political machines, anti-trust, remember the trust-busting presidents. They're for consumer protections like the Federal Food and Drug Act, remember Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. They're for voting reform. They're for the improvement of working and living conditions for the poor. They are for conservation of land and natural resources. They are usually supportive of women's suffrage and women's rights and child labor laws. They are supportive of Federal Reserve System and banking reform, prohibition, and a graduated income tax. So these are from memory aids taken from the slides, just so you can see them written out and remember them. So we have Sid Dig, sorry, it's backwards. And the 3 C's for Teddy Roosevelt, TR will always stand for Teddy Roosevelt or Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson's triple wall of privilege, the things that he attacks, very similar to Roosevelt's. And then Wilson's program, so the main achievements of Wilson's presidency in this time period. So the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Underwood Tariff Bill, the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Trade Commission. All right, questions to consider is where we'll leave off. So as you look at these questions, some of them do require you to think back to previous lectures. These first couple weeks of lectures are all interconnected and interrelated, so you'll have to remember urbanization and you'll have to remember about immigration and politics and populism to really understand the progressive era. So make sure you review the materials in this lecture and previous weeks and message me with any questions or concerns. Good luck.